Most people have heard of Unit 731, that infamous Japanese military unit that operated in occupied China during World War II. They're infamous for running gruesome experiments on prisoners, testing pathogens like anthrax, cholera, and plague. But the truth is far darker than the lab walls. Unit 731 wasn't just experimenting behind closed doors. Their work spilled into the real world in ways that were horrifying and deadly. When people think of biological weapons, it's often dismissed as just experimental or too dangerous to use. But Japan took it further. They actively deployed these weapons in the field. They dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, intentionally contaminated wells, and even tested cholera outbreaks by releasing infected food supplies. These weren't isolated incidents. They were deliberate strategies to inflict suffering and destabilize populations. In 1941, for instance, during a bombing raid over the city of Changde, Japanese forces released ceramic bombs filled with fleas carrying the plague. Tens of thousands of people died, both immediately and in the weeks that followed. It wasn't just locals who suffered. Japanese soldiers themselves sometimes fell victim to these experiments. They called it field testing, but for the people living in those cities, it was nothing short of a nightmare. The scale of the tragedy is hard to fully grasp. For decades, the exact number of victims remained unclear, but efforts to seek justice and compensation decades later uncovered the shocking magnitude of the deaths caused by Unit 731. In trials and investigations in the late 1990s and early 2000s, researchers discovered that the experiments and field deployments led to at least 500,000 deaths, with some estimates rising as high as 5 million when you include both immediate casualties and the prolonged epidemics that followed. These numbers are staggering, and they paint a grim picture of a military program that treated human life as expendable. And it gets worse. After the war, many of the scientists and officers responsible for these atrocities were never prosecuted. Instead, the United States quietly granted them immunity in exchange for their research. Their studies on pathogens, disease transmission, and biological weapons became highly valuable to the Americans during the Cold War. The people who had overseen mass suffering walked away, while the victims were left with trauma, lost families, and a history that was largely ignored for decades. This wasn't just horror behind closed doors. This was a systematic, intentional, and highly organized program designed to use disease as a weapon. Unit 731's work affected entire cities, disrupted agriculture and water supplies, and created epidemics that lasted months, sometimes years. It challenges the way we think about war, ethics, and the lengths governments might go to achieve power. Even today, the story of Unit 731 remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II. It's a reminder that some weapons are not just tools of destruction, they are instruments of human cruelty and suffering. The combination of secrecy, scientific ambition, and total disregard for human life created an experiment whose victims will never be fully counted. When we talk about biological warfare, it's tempting to think of it as something theoretical or even science fiction, but history proves it's real. It happened. And Japan's biological warfare program wasn't confined to experiments. It was unleashed on the world, with consequences that echoed far beyond the end of the war.